Greetings, everybody. It's Rene Harkeen, CIO at Single Point Partners. It's been a while since I've been reaching out to you. Today, I want to talk about inflation. You can't really open your browser or turn on the financial news without reading headlines about the recent spike in inflation, which is real. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words. So as you guys know, I like to start with a graph. This is U.S. inflation going back to 1966. As you can see here, we have in 2021, we see a pretty significant spike of both headline inflation at 5.4%, core inflation, which strips out the more volatile energy and food components of the basket. Still high at 4.5%, certainly very high by recent or modern history, right? Where the core inflation rate really has been around 2%, and during the 2010s, probably closer to 1.5%, right? So clearly a big spike, and relative to longer dated decades, the late 60s and 70s, right? Not quite as extreme, right? This is what we would call runaway inflation, right? This period from 1967, 68 until about 80, 81, where in the US, we saw average inflation rates of around 7.5%, 8% per year during that 12-year period. And then we had a very, very long period, multi-decades of very subdued inflation until now. And the big question, and what a lot of market strategists and economists and pundits are trying to figure out is this temporary or is this permanent? And are we on the cusp here in 2021 of something much bigger and problematic like what happened in the early 70s? So let me just spend a couple of minutes sharing with you what I think is a pretty strong case to believe that this spike is probably transitory and not the beginning of something more ominous, okay? And I want to share with you a slide that was put together by a third-party research firm called Pantheon Macroeconomics that we subscribe to. And they've done a nice job of putting together a chart of the cumulative excess household savings since the economy shut down after the pandemic was first revealed in March of 2020. And what you're seeing here in dollar terms, these are trillions of dollars. So it's 2.4 and 2.5 trillion dollars of excess savings that has built up as a result of families not being able to go out and spend according to their normal spending patterns, right? No more travel, no going out. On top of that, you've had several massive fiscal stimulus bills passed. The most recent one was right after the Biden administration took office. And the cumulative effect of that forced savings because of the lockdowns, the fiscal stimulus during the pandemic, and the most recent fiscal stimulus means that there is a massive amount of dry powder. In short, people have a ton of cash to spend. And at the same time, the economy, though it has begun to reopen, it has not yet been able to reopen and accommodate this much greater amount of demand. And keep in mind that before the pandemic, the economy was booming then, right? So the pandemic really was the proverbial wall that the economy hit. And it was a very strong economy. And now we're seeing that same impulse, right, of very strong spending, big increases in demand, and a lot of industries not being able to keep up with that demand. There's a couple of other slides I want to share with you. This is another very interesting one. U.S. corporations' bank deposits as a percentage of GDP. Again, there's a tremendous amount of dry powder. Households and companies are sitting on massive amounts of deposits that eventually are going to get spent down. And that's all very good for growth. But obviously, to the extent that there isn't enough you name it, enough commodities, inputs, workers, that does put upward pressure on prices, right? But the thing to note is that in order for us to believe that this current inflation spike that we see here, we would have to believe that there will be another similar fiscal stimulus of the same magnitude in 22, in 23, and 24, right? Because these periods of runaway inflation, which is what's problematic for your traditional 60-40 portfolio, right? They take years to develop, right? It doesn't happen over a year or even two. It took about 7 or 8 years from the late 60s till the mid 70s to really feel the full effect of this erosion in purchasing power and higher interest rates that are a byproduct of these runaway inflation periods. So in short, yes, we're seeing a lot of inflation. I think that there is going to be a normalization process over the next 6 months, where a lot of folks that maybe right now are not eager to get back into the workforce, perhaps because there's still fear of contagion, especially in certain industries like hospitality industry. Maybe there's concerns around childcare that's still not fully sorted out. But as all those things get sorted out over the course of the next 6, 9, 12 months, I think we're going to go back to a more normal labor market. We're going to go back to a more normal spending pattern. But there is one other force that needs to be considered over the long run, which is productivity, right? That even as companies are seeing much higher input costs and cost of labor, it is also true that companies have become much more productive, right? And the anecdotes that you hear is, right, telehealth, right, with the adoption of widespread Zooming and widespread virtual ways to communicate and collaborate, right? You now can see more people remotely through telehealth. On the banking side, we're seeing record number of bank branches being closed. A lot of the big banks are moving much more towards the digital channel, which is less labor intensive than staffing a branch, right? And of course, in the restaurant industry and in the hospitality industry, there's a lot of reports out there of restaurants adopting technology, for example, using tablets for customers to input their order and to settle their bill rather than having to use a human server, right? So obviously there's implications here for the labor market in the long run, but looking at it from the lens of owning stock in U.S. corporations, this kind of technology and efficiency that the technology unlocks means that companies can do a lot more with smaller workforces, right? And that's good for profits, and therefore that's supportive of the stock market, right? So I think in a nutshell, what we would say is there's a lot of cross currents here right now. I think a lot of the data right now is still somewhat muddied because we're still in this process of reopening and in this process of normalizing and resolving a lot of these bottlenecks and supply chain issues that were created when we shut down the economy. But when that plays through, I think that there's going to be probably some normalization here of the inflation rate.